Good morning, everybody. My apologies, my mic was off. My name is Paul Baker, and I work for International Economics, which is a partner in establishing this research platform for COVID-19 recovery, together with the World Bank and the United Nations Group. So we're very happy to welcome you to the third webinar on the theme of COVID-19 recovery. We have quite an impressive guest list of presenters for this particular webinar. Just before I quickly go through the agenda and open the workshop, I just wanted to remind you of where we're at. And this is the latest research carried out by McKinsey in terms of the predictions as to where we will be in terms of recovery at the global level in the next few years. And so we see that executives of major companies are not expecting a recovery to happen to get back to 2019 levels before 2022. And if we look at the latest IMF World Economic Outlook, we also see that the time to get back to the levels that we were at will take a number of years. There was a World Bank report that came out in October that looked at the decade that could be lost in Africa due to COVID-19. And so it's estimated that 2021 GDP per capita levels will be only at the levels of 2007. Obviously, many economies are also struggling with regard to fiscal and debt overhang that's happening from COVID-19. 14 million people are estimated to be pushed into poverty as a result of it. Schools have been affected by closure. Companies are operating at much lower levels of capacity. And of course, unemployment is at risk of being witnessed. In terms of policies carried out by Africa, many countries have obviously taken action, but generally the policies very much center around movement and lockdowns and border closures. And there's been very few other types of measures that are trying to actually help in terms of COVID recovery. So there are some measures around fiscal incentives and relaxation, as well as some trade facilitation measures, but these are very, very small in comparison to other types of policies that have been put in place across Africa. Just to say that the UNEP and our company carried out a survey for businesses that looked at what was the perspective in terms of recovery. And so, of course, digital commerce and digital platforms, as well as innovation, were seen as the main ways of moving forward in terms of COVID recovery. And of course, this also generates some concerns, perhaps, with regard to the social implications and unemployment implications that this may have longer term. So we're very happy that of the timeliness of this particular webinar. And so we have a host of different organizations that will be presenting. The first organization will be Business Mauritius, but we also have a number of United Nations organizations. We have academia, and then we will have the World Bank moderate a plenary discussion. The focus of today's webinar will be on social, business, and fiscal dimensions, as well as a green recovery, community-centered assessments, as well as digital transformation to help educational reforms in different countries and to push the education agenda. And then finally, we will also have a very useful comparison and lessons learned from other islands that will be given by a team from the University of Mauritius. So without further ado, I will invite the first presenter, Daden, from Business Mauritius, to speak about the social and business aspects of economic recovery. He's already told me that he will have to leave early, but that staff of Business Mauritius can take any questions that come up afterwards. I will remind all presenters that we only have 10 minutes. I will remind you halfway through your presentation that you've reached halfway. And I will also remind you 1 minute before the 10 minutes is up for you to close your arguments. We have a lot of speakers and we need to try and keep to the schedule. So thank you very much, and I invite Daden to make his presentation. Hello, Daden. Are you able to connect your screen?
I was on mute, but I was trying to share my screen. There we go. I'm here. No worries. Just reshare my screen. Is that okay now?
Hello, Daden. I'm afraid I'm not able to hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello? 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 Hi. Hello? No. Looks like you can't hear me. Hello, can you hear me now? Hello? Non, toujours pas? Unmute, stop, unmute. There's a moving note too. Hello? Okay. What? No, no. Paul, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, Daden.
I have joined from Asif's, my colleague's laptop. It looks like I cannot manage to. My mic is not working for some reason, so I'm just okay now.
We can hear you now. Do you want us to present for you or to project for you?
There we go. There we go. PowerPoint.
I think he's trying to.
Are you done? Is that okay now?
No. Not yet. If you like, we can share our screen. We can share your presentation on our screen, and you just tell us to move the slides.
It should work. Okay, let me try one last time, and then we're gone. If it doesn't work.
Sure.
There we go. Can you see anything? Well, let's put the slides on your side. I'm sharing, but it looks like you're not getting it.
No, unfortunately, we're not seeing it. Let us just share on our side. Just 1 minute.
Okay. Sorry for that. Okay. Sorry for that. We just missed something. Well, thanks to International Economics for setting this third webinar, I understand. I think it's a good series, and we're glad to collaborate on this one. We've been following the others. Glad to be active on this one. We have two surveys that have been run recently. In both cases, so I'm going to present these two surveys for mainly today. In both cases, the results are not out yet in a public manner. We've started to digest and diffuse some of the messages, but a public release of both separately is expected early December or mid-December. So whatever I'm going to say now is open, but please don't share further, because there's going to be a public release. So there we go. So let's move on to the next slide. I'll just say next, and you go ahead. So next. Right. So the first survey was by the Comité Solidarité. It was more on vulnerable populations, vulnerable families. Second one's a business survey that was conducted. And I'm going to tell you about the plan process for future surveys with us. And if there's time left, we'll talk about views of Business Mauritius on how to recover in a sustainable way. Since this is a research platform, I guess the two highlights will be most important here. Let's go. Next. Take control. Take control. Okay, so the first one is a rapid survey conducted by the Comité Solidarité. What is Comité Solidarité? It's a mix of NGOs that start working together under the confinement period under Business Mauritius. So we called in NGOs to assist companies that were willing to help on the ground, vulnerable families. So that started as a committee, and then it grew really big. And they decided to actually do an assessment. So it wasn't done by Business Mauritius, it was really done by a number of NGOs. So it's a rapid field assessment to understand the impact of COVID on vulnerable families. Results will be out in December. The data collection focused on poverty pillars that are most impacted by COVID. So employment, income, food, and health, plus another focus on use of technology, because everything goes online during confinement, psychosocial support, and registration on the SRM. What is SRM? The Social Register of Mauritius. What follows will explain why we're talking about that. So interviews were conducted by field workers from 21 NGOs already working with vulnerable families. So that helped in terms of field knowledge and trust to get real answers from people. Next. So the methodology was really prepared with the help of Tandrayen-Ragoobur, who run surveys regularly. So they established a protocol, prepared the questionnaire with the NGOs from the Solidarity Committee, did a pilot phase to test the questionnaire and reformulate questions, with vulnerable families, use Creole words, etc., to make sure the questions were simple and easy to get, and the answers would be coherent. So 14 leaders from those NGOs did the project management, trained interviewers on the questionnaire, on ethics, protocol, good practices. And the questionnaire was actually administered face-to-face for 54% and by telephone for 46% with assistance. I'm not seeing the last line. Can we remove this? Remove that. And data, yes, sorry. Data was input on the platform provided by Tandrayen-Ragoobur. So it's really a good collaboration that we had there. Next, please. So 21 NGOs mobilized their staff to actually run the survey. They actually interviewed 2,395 individuals, which was quite impressive, in 215 locations over 25 days in Mauritius. So that really covered the island of Mauritius quite well. And the data allowed for formulation of clear recommendations to support vulnerable families. So recommendations made to government, etc. I'll talk about that later. So the report was made in December. And they actually repeat this exercise in January to adjust the actions and to see how it evolved. Next, please.
Daden, you're halfway through your time.
Thank you. So basically, the selected findings was access to government support. 70% of respondents are actually not on the social register, but they are in a dire situation, which is an issue. 34% would actually be eligible to the SRM, but don't actually know how to get on the SRM, or not aware that there is a register that they should get on, or they tried and it didn't work out, but they are eligible. So government support would not be reaching them when they actually need government support. The impact on vulnerable households as of July was 18% of main revenue holders had actually lost their jobs, which is quite significant. 41% of households now have reduced revenue, households that already have low revenue. 67% are not autonomous on food. 56% are actually unable to supply assistance. There you go. 82% feel stressed by financial issues, more than actually by COVID. And 80% say they need non-physical means of handholding of support. So it's more psychosocial, non-material. Next. So just to conclude on that one, I'm already on the business survey for the sake of time. But you see from there that we have vulnerable people, vulnerable populations that were really affected and that need help, and not just financial or material help. That's very important on the way forward. And the business survey, I'll talk about rapidly now, is a survey to assess the impact on business, initiated by Business Mauritius in partnership with Statistics Mauritius. So it's a public-private partnership in collaboration with 9 sectoral organizations, private sector organizations, largest ones in Mauritius, all sectors. Technical assistance by UNDP in terms of financing and paying for the consultant to actually run the survey. The target was members of business associations and large establishments from the Statistics Mauritius list. So it's very important to note that we didn't target micro enterprises that were outside of our membership, or SMEs that were outside of our membership at this stage, right? So the survey is skewed on this side, but we announced it straight away. So 2,707 companies contacted, 15% response rate with a good size balance and a good sector balance for all 19 sectors, actually. So methodology conducted by DCDM Research, web survey with phone assistance. It was a standard UNDP questionnaire that we actually customized, and the business associations together worked to adapt it to the Mauritian context. Next, please. So the objectives you would guess, but maybe just the first one. I'll go through it fast and I'll skip the others, but you can get it afterwards. Was to assess the short, medium-term, and long-term impact of COVID on business and performance, and to try to anticipate as well expected impact. I'll just skip and go to next on that one. The objective, of course, was to, you can skip, yeah. The objective is for Business Mauritius to formulate policy recommendations when talking to government, or also to see how we can guide businesses better in terms of doing better. So preliminary findings, again, reminding you of the public launch, and the findings are on the period April to September 2020 versus April to September 2019. So 74% reported decline in sales, 65% noted fall in exports, 43% had cancellations, 35% of exporting companies are anticipating a drop in export by more than 20% over the next 6 months, and 33% of companies are expecting a rise in their own selling prices over the next few months. Next, please. Still some findings from this one. Majority of companies reported a decline in demand, expecting a decline in demand for the next 3 months. Decline in supply of raw materials as well. So this is our just confirmation of what we see or we feel. 88% did not release any full-time employees thanks to wage assistance support. 82% companies actually applied for benefited from the wage assistance support, and only 22% of companies actually applied for other government financial support, which is DBM, SME Equity Fund, etc., etc. 65% of these, 2/3, received the help they required, and those who received it generally satisfied with the quality of service, which is good. But we're still surprised by 22%, only 22% actually applied for financial support. Next, please.
Can I ask you, please, Daden, to finish on this last slide?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That should be okay.
On the planned surveys, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, which is good. We're planning to do this again in 6 months, simplify, remove questions that were not really pertinent, and then to run pulse surveys on specific issues. So this is a huge survey, multi-sectoral, but we would get fewer questions and smaller targets, sector-specific or issue-specific, and then we can do these every 3 months to monitor some specific elements or some specific sectors. That's what we have planned. Just to tell you what we had in plan, so you can share the PowerPoint afterwards. I'll finish there on the surveys. What we had next on our next slides was how we think that can move forward, and some plans for the tourism sector. But for the sake of time, I'll stop here.
Thank you very, very much, Daden. And indeed, we'll make the presentation available on the platform, and so everybody can then have a look at it and, of course, engage with you. Daden is the head of collaborative economic development at Business Mauritius. Thank you very much. Next, in the interest of time, I will move on to the next speaker, and we will have a plenary session at the end for any discussions or questions surrounding the presentations. So I'd like to now welcome Joy Kim, who's the Senior Economics Affairs Officer at the United Nations Economic Environment Programme, who will be speaking about fiscal reforms. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good morning, everyone. If you can just confirm that you can see my screen, that would be good. I have just shared my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so I think it's interesting to actually listen to what the Daden presented in terms of the business survey and what is actually happening on the ground. My presentation will be actually focusing on the agriculture and then food systems, given that it was identified as a priority sector for Mauritius recovery plan. So let me just focus on the fiscal reform for sustainable agriculture and food systems in a global context. But then toward the end, I would also present UNEP's proposal as a part of PAGE Green Recovery project in Mauritius in the coming months. So, as you know, the agriculture sector in many developing countries, as the largest employer, is a very important economic sector, contributing to a poverty reduction and enhancing food security, improving livelihoods and human health. But at the same time, that it also has a very huge impact on nature and climate change. And if they are not sustainably managed, it can be a main driver of biodiversity loss, and land use change and deforestation, which also result in fragmentation of natural habitat that is actually related to the increasing zoonotic disease, as we actually learned this round. As the largest consumer of world water, it actually has consumed like 70% of all fresh water use, so it can be a main polluter of fresh water and generating a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. So from a nature's perspective and climate change perspective, but also from economic perspective, economic implications of the agriculture sector is very significant in Mauritius and beyond. If you actually look at it from the consumption side of the agriculture and food system, it is also very significant in terms of its impact. What is actually surprising is that if you look at the consumption pattern of the food, around 30% of all food produced is lost or wasted, and it can actually result in nearly $1 trillion in economic losses. So there is a huge economic implications in terms of the food loss. Ironically, there is also a double burden of malnutrition and overconsumption. So in 2019, almost 690 million people were hungry, but estimated 2 billion people did not have a regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. And unfortunately, this is likely to be exacerbated by the impacts of the COVID-19. On the other hand, it also has huge health implications, including obesity related to unhealthy diet, and the leading risk factor for death from non-communicable disease. So the hidden cost of the global food system to the environment and public health are significant. And according to the WHO, the diet-related health cost linked to mortality and diet-related NCDs, non-communicable disease, will exceed $1.3 trillion per year by 2030. There is also social cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions associated with current dietary patterns that will reach more than $1.7 trillion per year by 2030. So clearly, there is urgent need to transform this agriculture sector for sustainable food system. And if you look at the current agriculture support policies, it does not actually incorporate this cost, the hidden cost, unfortunately. So in conclusion, you can say that currently the food is undervalued and the food price do not reflect the true cost of the production. Let me just share with you the global agriculture support scale and the implications. So if you look at the OECD countries and the 11 major developing countries, which basically accounts for like 80% of global agriculture production, they spend like $600 billion a year on agriculture support. But only 5% of this funding supports any kind of conservation objectives. Now, if you actually look into details, let's say in 2017, if you look at only OECD countries, they provide $228 billion in support to farmers, and half of that potentially is most environmentally harmful type of subsidies. And in comparison, if you look at the global financial flows for conservation and restoration of biodiversity, it only amounts to half of that. So you can see that the agriculture support that is environmentally harmful is totally lopsided and double of the amount that the global finance is going into for conservation and restoration of biodiversity. Now, if you look at the current fiscal stimulus measures that the countries are putting in place, and in particularly in the agri-food sector, the UNEP together with the University of Oxford is collecting the fiscal stimulus measures, policy measures in 50 largest economies, which is called the Green Recovery Observatory. The following measures we find the countries are putting in place for the immediate rescue measures and recovery in the agri-food sectors. And you can see that there are some measures that is more direct support to the agriculture sector, and there are some investment related to the sustainable forestry and the management and conservation. And unfortunately, as of today, it doesn't look very promising. Currently, the 50 largest economies put the fiscal stimulus measures, which accounts to like 97 billion US dollars. Support measures targeting immediate rescue measures, including liquidity support for large agribusiness, for startup SMEs in the agriculture, forest, fishing sector. But when it comes to long-term investment that can really help countries to build back better without actually harming the environment and nature, it is very limited at the moment. This is just to show how the reforming fiscal policy in the agriculture sector can support countries to build back better for sustainable agriculture and food systems by creating right incentives, but also by introducing environmental taxations. It can raise public revenues that can be used for other priority currently, and mobilize and leveraging private finance in this area and support the policy commitments in other areas such as climate change, biodiversity, and health. So
you've just got 2 minutes left, if I may.
Okay, thank you. So UNEP globally is conducting a global research to look at the global scale of agriculture support and subsidies and its impact on climate change, nature, nutrition, human health and equity, and what opportunities the reform of such support can provide by repurposing such support. And there will be a global report to be launched next year together with UNDP and FAO. And just to wrap up by presenting briefly what we are proposing as a part of page recovery project in Mauritius, we are proposing to look at the scaling of finance for sustainable food systems from both public and private finance side, given that there is a new nature economy that could generate 10 trillion US dollars in annual business value and create 395 million jobs by 2030, according to the World Economic Forum. But also there is investing nature not only strengthens resilience, but also drives a significant economic benefit and job opportunities, according to the analysis that Oxford School has done together with us in terms of economic multipliers and positive climate impacts. So what we are proposing is to conduct a rapid assessment diagnostic toolkit for scaling up public and private finance for nature-based solutions and climate-smart agriculture to support more sustainable, resilient food systems as part of efforts for green recovery. And this actually entails analyzing impact of current fiscal policies and economic incentives for financing nature-based solutions and climate-smart agriculture, and also identify priority reforms to enable fiscal policy environment and potential new green finance instruments to scale up public and private finance and investment. We will be working with our partners using the existing platforms that UNEP is involved, such as Net Zero Asset Alliance, Principles for Responsible Banking, principles, and the Green Fiscal Policy Network that UNEP is in partnership with IMF and GIZ. I will stop here. The remaining information about what UNEP does and what the green fiscal policy of UNEP is delivering in other PAGE countries, you can find it in the presentations that I shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. Fantastic presentation, very, very interesting. And indeed, yes, we'll be happy to showcase the presentation on the platform for people to follow up. Very good follow-up on what you've been presenting is the next presenter, who's Karishma Ansaram, who's a doctoral researcher at the IESEC School of Management, and she's specializing in climate financing. And she'll be making a presentation on different instruments available for the green recovery, financial instruments. Thank you, Karishma. Karishma, I can see your presentation, but I cannot hear you.
Just unmuted myself. Is it good now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone. So I'm currently doing my research on carbon pricing, carbon markets, and climate change around the world. And I'll be guiding you through the different carbon pricing mechanisms that are available for a green recovery in Mauritius, and also talk about some ongoing research that I'm part with. So to start with, there is a fiscal chain effect of the COVID-19, starting from a fiscal pressure, that is, the COVID-19 has created a financial pressure for immediate spending from the government side, while reduced tax revenues, but also lending pressure, whereby public sector debt is increasing, and also non-performing loan are on the rise as well. So in all that, there is a supply side pressure that is incurring, and this leaves less room for the supply of finance. But in all that, we are going to see why we need to focus on green recovery. So the COVID-19 has shown us that we need to test our resilience in response to potential climate-related disasters, and we need to be prepared. And the second motive for going for a green recovery is that the think tanks and international organizations have noted that even if we meet all the national contributions that have been submitted by all countries, we are not going to meet the 2-degree goals. So this is the right time to make a shift towards a pathway towards low carbon economy, and also mostly because this pandemic has interrupted the global supply chain, including those for renewable energy, whereby you can find those project developers are mostly at small scale, and they are facing most constraint into access to finance. So the type of green finance available are 2 types. You can have the public green finance or private green finance. I've tried to illustrate it through the diagram, which is from Institute for Climate Economics. So the public one, as you can see, is going to channel to public project developers and also private companies. And the private one comes from commercial banks or savings or revenues and investors. They go towards private companies and households towards different sectors. But for Mauritius, you would notice that we are mostly reliant on the public finance. And I'm going to critically assess this as well, how this reliance is not good in terms of achieving our climate goals and also towards a green recovery. So I'm going to talk about the carbon pricing tools, also about the green budgeting and the green fiscal policies. So moving on to green budgeting, the public versus private green finance in Mauritius. The budget post-COVID-19 that has been presented had a lot of measures that would address sustainable development in Mauritius. But from one of the surveys that I did pre-COVID-19 on the green finance instrument that covered mostly the private green finance instruments are available in Mauritius, showed that both on the business and individual level, on a score of 1 to 5, like 5 being well aware of those finance tools, it shows that most of them were not aware and also had not adopted those private green finance instruments that are on the market. And Mauritius has also adopted some environmental tax, but we are going to see how different carbon pricing mechanism can be adopted to complement those measures that are already existed. So the first tool that the OECD has proposed is a green budgeting tools. This has been adopted by few countries until now, and however, there is no blueprint for this tool. That is, it is tailor-made, customized, and there are some international organizations that are working along with countries to test this green budgeting. So what is it? It is that you identify the public expenditure and also assess to what extent it is related and fighting against climate change. So you have different steps, such as you start with the green budget tagging. and you need to do an environmental impact assessment for each of the items out there, and then you try to include carbon pricing mechanism, that is external price, such as carbon tax, or even you are trading your emissions, and you have a green perspective. And not to forget, one useful recommendation is to use tool for reporting on the stimulus package, that is all the stimulus package that are being adopted. You need to communicate about it and make an impact assessment and distributional impact analysis about how those measures are really affecting individuals, households, and firms. So this is my core part of my analysis. So the INDC's financing from Mauritius. So as you all know, Mauritius is a signatory for the Paris Agreement, and we have set binding targets to ourselves. But as you can see, most of the climate goals mentioned in this in our contributions is mostly heavily reliant on donor funding, be it for adaptation or mitigation finance, if we want to roll out climate actions in Mauritius. So we are reliant on donor funding. So I'm going to propose different ways, because when developed countries are this donor funding comes from developed countries, and developed countries are themselves in a dire situation. So we can expect a low level of public finance to flow during the coming years. So it is now the time for Mauritius to investigate into private climate finance mechanism, namely the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This is where my core PhD research is focused on. So it is about the international transfer mechanism.
So you have 1 minute left. Sorry.
Yes. And Mauritius should look into bilateral climate protection agreement. This is related to carbon offsetting. And lately, developed countries like Switzerland and Ghana has been entering into climate protection agreement to offset their emissions. And also implementation of a carbon tax, adoption of sustainable banking standards, and also mobilizing private climate finance. And we know that last year, 2 years ago, the stock exchange on Mauritius has tried to implement the green bond framework in Mauritius, but still much more needs to be done to attract those investors, because none of the project has been listed yet. And we need to look into natural disasters insurance, so that the burden for adaptation and disaster-related finance is taken up from the government. I just touched upon one of my research that is ongoing with Frankfurt School of Finance and Management and Africa Research and Impact Network. So I'm going to assess, I just started it last month. So I'm going to assess the case of 9 seas islands and how they are going to finance their climate goals, and particularly in terms of private climate finance mechanisms. So this is to wrap up from me. If you want to have more information, you can connect with me. I have other ongoing projects and publications that are coming out, green finance and also on disaster risk reduction practices in Mauritius. But mainly I'm going to focus on global carbon pricing mechanisms under the Paris Agreement for my thesis. That's it from me, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karishma. Very, very interesting presentation, and I'm sure you'll have some follow-up with UNEP and others. Sorry, just in the interest of time, I'll move forward. Our next speaker is going to speak about artificial intelligence tools and digital innovations to promote education and access to education. And so we're pleased to welcome Natalia Amelina, who is Chief of Unit at UNESCO. Thank you, Natalia.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm very glad to share with you our recent project in Mauritius. So thank you for inviting us to this webinar. And today I will present to you our project, which is titled Integrating Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovations to Strengthen Inclusion and Equity in Education in Africa. This is a joint initiative of UNESCO and Chengdu Culture and Tourism Development Group, which is from China, designed for and aimed at strengthening inclusion and equity in teaching, learning, and monitoring of education and lifelong learning. The implementation of the project will promote equitable opportunities for education and professional development, promotion of social involvement and intercommunication. The initiative will also facilitate developing capacity of young people, especially those from vulnerable groups, through further learning and training. We have chosen 2 targeted countries for this project. They are Rwanda and Mauritius. The criteria for the choice of these 2 countries in the African region were, first of all, basic readiness of the society in general and the education system in particular in these targeted countries. And secondly, demonstrated commitment of the government to mainstream digital technologies for inclusive education and training as a strategy to achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 4. Entire education systems in the African countries are gearing up from the pursuit of SDG 4, aiming to ensure that all children are in school and learning by 2030. The project will contribute to achieving the Education 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goal number 4 targets for equity, for quality education, and will be implemented in accordance with the 3 United Nations guiding principles defined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. They are human rights-based approach, leave no one behind, gender equality, and women empowerment. The main purpose of this project is to facilitate bridging the digital divides in the targeted countries, bearing in mind educational and technological needs of these countries. In this region, distinction as to gender, disability, poverty, ethnicity, language, or any other characteristics make groups of population such as disabled persons, women and girls, indigenous people and ethnic minorities, children living in rural areas, and other vulnerable groups excluded from education. Access to school for children from such vulnerable groups is often limited by lack of understanding about their needs and lack of trained teachers, classroom support, learning resources, and facilities. Artificial intelligence and digital innovations tools may essentially enhance educational outcomes and provide critical services to those who are in most need. The following focus of activities is suggested for the targeted countries. Reinforcing the national education system based on ICT integration to eliminate gender disparities and ensure equal access to education for girls and women, their empowerment with the necessary 21st century skill sets, including strengthening access to STEM education. Supporting transformation of national inclusive education system based on the integration of artificial intelligence and digital innovations for education of persons with disabilities and other vulnerable groups of students. So as you can see, one of the priorities, one of the focus will be made on girls and women, and another focus will be made on persons with disabilities. Let me briefly inform you about the main activities of the project, which we are starting to implement in Mauritius. First of all, we are going to conduct the needs assessment of gender equality and inclusive education for promoting mainstreaming of artificial intelligence and digital innovations. We plan to develop national report based on the selected case studies and review of the implemented assessment. Secondly, we plan to prepare action plans and guidelines in line with identified priority needs of the targeted countries, including Mauritius, for supporting transformation of national inclusive education systems based on integration of artificial intelligence and digital innovations. After that, we plan to develop training programs and conduct trainings for master trainers on competency development in this area. And what is very important, we are going to establish a resource center. It is planned to equip this resource center with specific hard and software for vulnerable groups of students, and this resource center will work as a platform not only to access to education of students, but also to train teachers and administrators. And finally, we are going to develop an online resource portal where we plan to put various materials such as guidelines, recommendations, collections of best practices, and many other interesting things to strengthen networking and capacity building of the country. For another thing, we're going to strengthen Open EMIS. This is an open education management information system, which is a system for educational developed for educational sector. Its main purpose is to collect, analyze, and report data related to the management of educational activities. Initially, this Open EMIS will be covered by UNESCO and serves as a response to member states in Mauritius need in the area of tools for educational strategic planning. And finally, I just want to say that we hope that implementation of this project activities will have a long-term growing impact on quality, inclusion, and equity in education, and as a consequence on further job security, advancement of living standards, equitable opportunities for personal and professional development, promotion of social involvement and intercommunication. Thank you very much for your kind attention. That's all from me. If you have any questions, you may contact me via the email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for that very interesting and on-time presentation as well. Really, really appreciate it. Our next speaker is Dr. Jaime de Melo, who is a researcher with the University of Mauritius, but he's also a professor emeritus at the University of Geneva and works quite closely with our company. And Jaime, you'll be presenting on lessons from other island economies. If I can just remind you that it is just a 10-minute presentation. Do you want us to share the presentation?
Hello?
I can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very interesting webinar, and I think it would be great but in principle, to always have everyone share the PowerPoints, so everyone can have access to them automatically. So what I will do, we're presenting, this is work mostly carried out by Verena, and Verena will be speaking. Are you sharing my screen there?
Yes, we can do so. We'll do it now.
Okay, so the outline, we're just going to talk about more about not what countries should do, but where countries are so far, with emphasis on comparison across countries. Verena will do the short term, and she'll be speaking in 2 minutes, so 1 minute, and then I'll do the long-term challenges. So we all know what the short-term challenge is. That's what's on the first slide. Is the medical economy loop. The idea is you should really try to stop the spread of the virus through non-medical, non-medical restrictiveness indices to try and measure government policies. This is what Verena will cover now, and then afterwards across all the islands, and then I will talk for a few minutes about the future, that is about climate change and ecosystem resilience. Verena, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So I'll be talking more in terms of the short-term challenges and basically comparing a group of island economies where we have data. We've been looking at death, also in terms of the number of cases and in terms of the stringency index and the Google Mobility Index for these islands, and comparing the situation since the first COVID-19 case till date, and what has been the number of cases, death, etc., and comparing with the situation in these islands. So I would go to the next slide where we try to compare Mauritius with other island economies. So what we did is basically looking at cumulative confirmed COVID-19 cases per million in relation to VS GDP per capita, and we've been looking at the data till 23rd of November, and we've seen that countries with higher GDP per capita have been having more confirmed COVID-19 cases per million people, and we can compare Mauritius with other countries like Singapore, Trinidad and Tobago, and Mauritius and New Zealand, as we know, have been doing quite well. And countries like at the top there are Bahrain, Malta, Iceland, and Ireland with more higher number of COVID-19 cases per million people. If we move to the next slide, where we've been looking at COVID-19 deaths per million vs GDP per capita, again, for the period till November 23rd, we will still be seeing countries up there like Ireland, Iceland, Cyprus, and again, we know that Mauritius, in terms of death, compared to New Zealand, we haven't been doing that well, but then we've been doing better compared to other islands like the Maldives and the Cape Verde Island, etc. Apart from the number of cases and death, we also been plotting in the next slide the situation for these island economies. If we, in terms of death rate vs population density, again, we can see a weak association of death rate and population density there. Yeah, so these are the islands where we had the data, and we've been comparing Mauritius again with Singapore, Sri Lanka, Comoro, and then Suriname is there where the data has been available. So we could see a weak link basically between in terms of death rates and population density. The next slide, please. Yeah, so we've been looking at cases and death. and trying to see the link between the two for the islands. And you will see for Mauritius there, it's much lower compared to the other countries. So similar trend for those countries up there. Again, Malta, Ireland, whereas Mauritius and New Zealand have been doing much better compared to the islands like I said, Ireland, Trinidad and Tobago, Cyprus. Next, please. Yeah. So rather than only focusing on the number of deaths, confirmed death and number of cases, and trying to look at it in terms of GDP per capita and population density, next we've been looking at COVID-19 tests. And the problem with that is that for many countries, the data is missing. We did have for Mauritius, but we didn't include Mauritius there because we took the local data, but on our world in data, we had only these few countries where COVID-19 tests were available. So we would be, the next stage of this study is trying to build a database for the test, COVID-19 tests for the islands in our sample, so that the comparison can be much better and we can know the situation in terms of per capita COVID-19 tests which have been undertaken across the islands. So we know, for instance, that Mauritius has been doing well in terms of the total number of tests. Again, New Zealand is there as well. Okay, the index which have been mentioned in our study and also which we have been used across many studies is the stringency index. And so it's more related to containment measures implemented by islands over the period since the first COVID-19 case till now. And you've seen initially there has been a rise, of course, in SI, the stringency index, around mid-March 2020. And then you can see this rise going up straight there. And in some countries, the SI has been reaching even 100. And then there has been a fall in SI index around end of September, but then again picks up from November onwards. So there has been a trend increase initially with a number of measures being implemented by governments in the different islands. We can see that, so we've been comparing data on the SI index. Unfortunately, we don't have the SI measure for all the islands, but for the few which we could see, there is a trend, similar trend with a rise initially in mid-March, then a rise around August, then fall again end of September, then peaking again as from November 2020. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is similar. We've split the islands in 3 groups because we didn't have, we couldn't put all the islands in one diagram, then it would not be readable. So basically we could see the same trend across the island. For some islands, we could see that the stringency index has remained fairly stable after September 2020. Can we move to the next one, please? Yeah, we also try to look at social distancing patterns, and maybe I would leave that part to Jim. I leave the floor for you, Jim, if that's okay.
Yes, let me. Yeah, just what we do is, like everyone else, we're taking the Google mobility data, and we're trying to see if the patterns are the same. And if you go to the next 2 slides very quickly, because we're running out of time, what you do tend to see is initially, if you move the slide, what you do see initially is very similar patterns, and then after they're somewhat different, and there's some interesting cases where, for instance, in the next slide you see that Taiwan, it was all the time very low. In other words, they shut the borders, but then afterwards, the mobility was exactly the same as it was in January before the beginning of COVID. So there you see really quite a bit of difference among these islands in terms of social distancing patterns. And there's even one on La Réunion we're not so sure about. Since we're running out of time, let me go very quickly onto the second part. I'll just spend 2 minutes. The first one is, well, you know, this is a different, we all know, we're all saying it, but we don't know exactly how. This is a different shock from the 2008, 2009 shock, what Baldwin and others call a paper clip shock, because we have a temporary shock, and that is likely to have permanent effects. And we don't all know what these permanent effects, and some say, well, you know, you turned off the hose to stop the virus, but when you start the hose again, you open up the hose again, we're not so sure if there are leaks in it. And that's what we really don't know. But in any case, what is pretty clear, there is, we have a slide there showing that this emerging technologies or industrial revolution 4.0 is going to have a big challenge for jobs, which was also mentioned by previous speakers. If you go to the next slide, you have rules-based logic jobs. These are the jobs that are going to disappear. And, you know, some of the islands, including Mauritius, are if not heavily, they are in these types of jobs that will be very easy to replace by machine work. And then there are the jobs that depend on human work. And when you look at it, some of those, like writing a convincing legal brief, is maybe not too difficult, but there are others which are more difficult, and that would require a large improvement or a much more effort, at least in Mauritius and other islands probably as well, in education. And the previous speaker spoke about that, and that I think is extremely important. And then the second part, and that is on SIDS, where this is an area, if you move to the next. Yeah, the SIDS, basically, everyone is saying quite rightly, this is really an opportunity to address a challenge. The challenge is everywhere, not just in the SIDS, everywhere, but in the SIDS, maybe even more or islands, maybe even more than other places, just because they're so much more vulnerable. Now, from the point of view of climate change and resilience, I mean, the islands have contributed very little. They're going to have to adapt for sure, because they are not going to control the amount of CO2 emissions. So what we're in the planet to reach the 2 degrees or whatever. So what we're doing, and we haven't finished, we're doing a new index, which is if you look at you go down, if you go to the next slide, we're developing this EPI index. The weights are on the next slide if you have the time to look at it, but just trust me on this. There's one is the health of the ecosystem. A lot of this is on the quality of the air and so on, CO2. Well, the CO2 emissions, that is very important for climate, but from the point of view of the islands, they're contributing so little, that may not be the largest way. So we're changing, we haven't done it yet, but we're changing this weighing system so that we'll have a set of indices that are going to reflect a little bit better the ecosystem vitality of the islands. And the objective here is to see and show to what extent the SIDS are doing different or than other countries. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jim, Verena, and sorry, it's a complex topic to be covered in just 10 minutes. But thanks for sharing your insights and your research in this, and we're looking forward to see the final paper as well. Just to go on to our last speaker, who's going to be talking about community-centered vulnerability assessments, which is carried out by the UNDP. Pamela Bapoo-Dundoo is the National Coordinator for the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Programme. Over to you, please.
Yes, hello everyone. Very interesting presentations. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly explain what we did. For those of you who do not know the Small Grants Program, we are in Mauritius. We've been in Mauritius for the last 25 years. The Small Grants Program allocates $50,000 US per project to local communities for focal areas that you can see. Over the last 25 years, we've funded 178 projects. You can see some of the nice pictures that's down there, and you can read about the total co-financing and financing. So during the national lockdown, what happened is that the Ministry of Environment, the minister himself, solicited our support for a very vulnerable community, which is in the suburb of Port Louis, the capital city, which is called Thirodrigue, for one very good reason, because the people who live there are migrants who've come from Rodrigues Island in search of work. So these people were found to be hard hit by the COVID-19 confinement. And after a site visit, we enlisted the support of our grantee. I don't know if that grantee is online right now. It's the Mauritius Red Cross Society. We enlisted them to carry out a community vulnerability and capacity assessment, which is a very powerful tool which we practiced in other projects about disaster risk reduction, and which has proven to be very useful. Just walk you through Thirodrigue for those of you who do not know. This is Résidence La Cure. These are the houses of the people who live in that area. You can see the cables which are down there on the dirt are actually electricity power supply for the houses. You can see waste accumulating. It's a very, very poor area. Look at those cables. Very poor area. So the estimated population for La Résidence La Cure, which is where Thirodrigue is found, is around 17,000 people. And as I said, undocumented migration from Rodrigues. And they have settled down in places, they are called squatters. They have settled down in places which are flood prone. We found out, obviously, that they are very vulnerable communities, and they are dependent on daily wages. So during the lockdown, most of them were severely impacted because they did not have any livelihood. They have higher vulnerability to natural disasters, of course, and floods, because they are found on a slope of a mountain. So each time there are heavy rain, torrential rains, it's very difficult for them. What we found out during the assessment was quite different, though. While we were thinking that it was only the flood, the Mauritius Red Cross found something else. So what is briefly the VCA? It's actually a disaster preparedness assessment. That is, you will evaluate with the community their exposure to natural hazards and see how to best prioritize their issues. It serves to draw up action plans and recommendations, and which are shared. Mishka. Oui. Appelle Orvino Chico. Merci. Ah, attends, c'est arrivé. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Pamela. Yes, you're back on. Sorry, you froze it.
Yeah, there was an issue. Okay. Okay, so I was here, right? So a lot of community involvement. So how did the Mauritius Red Cross proceed? What they did was set up posters everywhere in the area. You can see that poster on the right-hand side, telling people that they need to come to that meeting, that there will be an explanation about the process of the VCA. 4 VCA sessions were held, and 2 site visits in the locality with community members to assess the threats. Over 80 members of the community.
Pamela, sorry, your presentation is not being shown anymore on the screen.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh. Excuse me. Hide, share content. There you are. Can you see it?
Yes, we can again. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what happened. So I was saying the poster is on your right, and it shows that the people were invited to participate in the community meeting to explain the process of the VCA. The Mauritius Red Cross carried out 4 VCA sessions and 2 site visits to understand the locality. Over 80 members, as I said, participated in the VCA, and they identified the main challenges. These are the main threats. So we thought that it was going to be only flooding and livelihoods, but actually cyclones and floods figured, but also very much drugs and teenage pregnancies. So the VCA brought out these issues and which are the age groups that are affected: youth, for example, 20 teenage mothers, and these teenagers are affected as from 15 years old. So the general observations on your left, upper left-hand side, what you can see, well, I'll show that picture again, is the prioritization exercise. It's done in a very user-friendly manner with, they have identified the threats. They put the threats on a piece of paper, put it on a table, and then they vote using red beans, broad beans, any other material. They vote all of them to identify which are the ones that are highest priority and lowest priority. So general observations, of course, huge impact of COVID-19 on the livelihood of the population. There is, however, a high motivation to change things, so that's very interesting. There is a high dependency on external support, political support, and local authorities support. Of course, poverty heightens their vulnerability. And last thing, which is very important, is there is huge stigmatization on these people. Every time there is a drug case, people would say that it comes from Thierry or from Résidence La Cure. So there is no positive communication. What is the way forward? We will soon, we already have the draft report of the VCA. This will be presented to the community members for their validation. And then it will be shared with the Minister of Environment and other ministers who requested this study, members of parliament of the region, and so on. So also local donor community and local authorities. The communities have been able to identify the threats. They will be they have already started identifying the solutions as well. So based on this assessment, they will be able to develop viable proposals. We hope for them to use this report to show to everyone who wants to come into that area and to support them. These are our challenges. Don't go about doing it again, doing a survey again and questioning us again. You may have updates, but these are our challenges, and so this is the way you can support us to tackle those challenges. That's it from me. I want to thank the Mauritius Red Cross Society and all the, of course, the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Over.
Thank you very much, Pamela. for a very interesting presentation again. And we come to the end of all our presentation sessions. And I want to thank all the speakers for really making some excellent contributions. I really appreciate that. I will pass on the plenary discussion now to Eric from the World Bank, who will be managing that process. And just before I go, I just wanted to also mention that yesterday I attended an event organized by the Telfair Institute, which is a new institute on the campus of Kütin University. And I know that Miriam is amongst us on this particular webinar. And they were also discussing in particular how Mauritius could move forward as a result of COVID, but also more generally, what would be the long-term strategy for economic development and social development in Mauritius. So there's a lot of interesting initiatives, and I think it's quite good to cooperate and try and work together towards finding some common solutions. So Miriam, if you have a few questions you'd like to pose or some remarks to make in the plenary, you're more than welcome to do so. But I'd just like to thank everybody very much, and I'll now pass the baton over to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Let me just open the floor to questions without any further ado. In order to avoid everyone speaking over one another, may I suggest that we use the raise your hand function in next to the chat button in Microsoft Teams. So whoever wants to come in with a question or comment, please do raise your hands. Oh, I see we have two already. May I ask Thomas to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I just put my question already in the chat so that it's not lost. The session is about green recovery. We have green recovery. We have to differentiate economic recovery and the green aspect of it. Economic recovery in Mauritius is depending, and this was very clear from the presentations, to a large degree on tourism. And but tourism here means we are dependent on long-haul flights with lots of CO2 emissions. So green recovery would actually be a contradiction. There, I would like to throw in the idea of discussing more seriously something like a carbon tax for arriving passengers at the airport, because that would be, I mean, the cost of the flights. This is something that is not really very price sensitive. Also, because it's a unique destination, and that money could be used for mangrove reforestation, afforestation, which is probably the most or one of the most efficient carbon sequestration projects that would have here several positive effects from employment, but also protecting of coastal areas apart from the just carbon sequestration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Let me open next to Irie Kim.
Thank you, Eric. This is Joy, one of the presenters. I just wanted to respond to a question by Thomas on tourism as a part of green recovery. I think that's an interesting question indeed. If you actually look at the stimulus measures that other countries actually have put in place, as I presented before. I mean, one thing that what the governments or the government of Mauritius can consider, because what we do see is that there is a bailout of airline industry because they're actually hit by the COVID-19, but what we have seen in some countries, what they actually have done is they actually have given a conditional bailout to the airline industries that they can actually introduce these measures to address some of the CO2 issues. and also the use of fossil fuels in the airline industries, so that the airline industries can perhaps back into the business, but in a more greener pathway. And of course, there are several things that you can also do in terms of the green tourism or ecotourism. The UNEP is also working with the several countries in this area. But I mean, as a part of the recovery measures, there are certain things that we can actually learn from other countries to do in a way that is different from the others that are likely to go back to the business as usual growth, not the green pathway. Over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see another hand up by Miriam Blin.
Yes, hello. Thank you. I'm going to ask two questions, if that's okay. The first one is regarding the data that was presented by Business Mauritius, I think. I was quite surprised to see that more than 30% of those surveyed were not in the social registry. And so my question is, because it's quite easy to fall into poverty, but quite difficult to come out, what kind of mechanism is in place to support these families who are not on the social register of Mauritius? And what are the criteria to be on the social register in Mauritius? So that's my first question. And the second question is very quick. Should we actually tax food for its carbon footprint? And if so, how can we do it in a way that remains affordable for more vulnerable households? How to make it progressive? That's it. Thank you very much.
I can answer that if you want, Daden. I'm actually still here. I managed to stay online. Paul, can I, or Eric?
Please go ahead, Daden.
Yes, actually, thanks for the question. The statistics is not 34%; it's 70% of the respondents who are actually not on the SRM at the time of the interview. So out of those 2,700 something, and 34% were actually eligible. So half of those were actually eligible for the social register. So they didn't know, or they applied, or didn't have time, or they went through it in the wrong manner, or didn't complete the process, whatever. About the criteria for social register, I'm not a specialist, but it's mostly in terms of revenue, in terms of material conditions. So that's also something of a recommendation that the Comité Solidarité made, to say that the SRM itself, in its definition, is not encompassing enough of poverty. So they are proposing, they're recommending a wider SRM, so that people get support for other reasons. So I won't go into that. That's going to be made public, but certainly your question is very pertinent. A number of people are not on the SRM, so they're not getting the help that they would deserve. And a number of people are not eligible for the SRM when they should be, in fact. So we need to redefine the SRM also. So people need help to go on it, and people need, the SRM itself needs to be reviewed. I know this is being discussed, so this goes in line with a number of, even what government is thinking. That's one. I'm going back to the first question on green growth. What we've seen in the business survey, I'm shifting to the business survey, is that most companies, small and large, are saying they're going to maintain or increase their spending or investment in sustainable development initiatives. So despite the crisis, despite the reduced cash flow, despite the reduced revenue, they've realized the importance of sustainability in general. So they actually, this is one of the rare things that they're going to increase in terms of spending. It's on the sustainability initiatives that they had, or new sustainability initiatives that they hadn't planned. So that we've seen. I'm not going into the percentages, but that's a trend, a clear trend that we saw from the survey, which is good.
Okay. I see one hand still up. I don't know if it's another question from you, Irene Kim, or if it's just still up from your last intervention.
No, I wanted to respond to the questions about the food taxation issues.
Please go ahead.
That's okay. Okay, thank you very much. I mean, one thing that I would actually say is that it's not necessarily, going to be the case in Mauritius. We need to look into it, but in general, if the countries are actually subsidizing the water irrigation system in the agriculture sector, and then, subsidizing the energy being used in the agriculture sector, so that's why it's actually distorting the price of food that is so low. I think there is no, I mean, it doesn't actually make sense to try to tax the consumption of food in that regard, because it doesn't make any sense. I think what is important is to actually remove all these distorting, components, so that the food actually reflects the right price. And then on top of that, if there is a need to reflect the true cost of food in this regard, what can be done, as I mentioned, is that removing all these distorting measures and then try to compensate it in a different way. So there are different ways of supporting the production side and the consumption side of agriculture, in the way that is more sustainable and greener. For instance, like, instead of providing a direct liquidity to the farmers, you actually provide, for the investment of the irrigation technologies, better technologies in the irrigation and the production side of the agriculture. Or you actually provide a different support for the consumer side, but you actually have to be careful and then make sure that these consumption patterns that I have mentioned is not going to be wasteful, or has impact on health of the consumers. So there are different ways of dealing with it. I mean, clearly, it may actually increase the price of food in the longer term, but also there are many know-how that has already been accumulated, that the way how you introduce these measures gradually, and communicate with the public in terms of why this is happening, when this is happening, how it's going to happen, and how it's going to impact them, and whether there may be some mitigation measures that it can be put in place by the government. So I think there are plenty of important steps that the government needs to take to move forward, but clearly move forward in a more sustainable manner without harming the public in a way that is maybe easily anticipated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any additional hands up, and we're also already a little bit behind our time schedule. So let me just say from my end, thank you very much to the presenters today. Thank you very much for the rich discussion. I think it's quite fascinating to see how we're moving on from the kind of firefighting discussions on, oh my God, what is happening, where's the fire, where to spray the water, so to speak, towards a more forward-looking perspective on what a recovery strategy might look like in the medium to longer term. I look forward to our next event. I really enjoy these interactions, and I just have one big request to everyone connected today, to please register to the online platform that we created for this group. You can see the link right smack on top of the invitation that you've received for today's event. So if you click on where it says Mauritius Research Platform on COVID-19, you can get there. We're still fiddling around a little bit with the website, so not everything might be working perfectly, but the idea was really to create a digital space for an online community that would allow us to have internal discussions on things like, what themes for these webinars, identifying speakers, exchanging data, and also very importantly, once you register, others who are registered will be able to see you there with your respective fields of expertise. So it will really support our networking efforts. I believe Pierre Falavier from the UN Resident Coordinator's Office has the final words on today's meeting. So Pierre, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Well, thank you, Eric. You said actually most of what I was going to say, so I'll try to cut from that. Just to say thank you again for the very interesting presentation. They're really adding to what has become a very rich body of research with what we've already covered in the other two webinars. And I think their content will feed the conversation way beyond the COVID recovery and into the long-term choices that we need to update priorities to accelerate the movement towards the SDGs. I think in Mauritius, but in many other places, from early next year, we'll have to revisit some of these priorities based on the lessons learned from COVID on what to focus the most on. And I think a lot of the discussion and the work done on a better, greener, more sustainable and inclusive recovery will be really at the center of these decisions, these choices that will be taken next year. So it's very important, I think, that from what started by just a series of presentation, we start building, or we continue to build a strong community of researchers and from researchers to be able to bring this into policy and programming and policy decision making and programming. So as Eric said, we invite everyone to really join the existing platform, because this is to become a place for dialogue and for exchanges between researchers. But aside from the researchers, we also need to find a way to involve more of the participants who may not be researchers themselves. Any of your views and examples, maybe from other platforms you may be part of, or other research networks you may be part of, on how to improve our platform will be extremely helpful. We also need to find ways to disseminate the content of this work quite widely, both in Mauritius, but also, I would say, in other island states, in the region and possibly globally. We have a lot of discussions with the COVID recovery that are really across the different oceans and across the island states. There is, for instance, a discussion that has been renewed on understanding the multiple vulnerabilities of SIDS and how to respond to them, both at the local level, but also in terms of global support, how to improve the global support to small island developing states, even when, as in the case of Mauritius, they are seen as high income. So we need to find a way to link up with other research groups working in these other island states and across the different oceans. So for this, we'll continue the UN to work with the World Bank and with international economics, and hopefully with academia also, to build upon this research work. And I do hope that next year, for instance, one thing we could do early next year is start to organize one of more workshops that could revisit some of the themes that we've studied so far and bring back the presenters along with decision makers on this particular theme, and trying to make sure that what has for now been largely a discussion among researchers will find a way to bring this into policy decision making. I think that will be very important. So again, thank you very much for your contribution. Do not hesitate to pass on the word about this work, to invite other people to read the work done, to download the presentation and the recordings, and to use them already. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you, or most of you, during the next webinar. Bye-bye. Hello, I think.
I don't know if Paul has any closing words. Otherwise, I wish everyone a